When disaster strikes, a war, a flood, an earthquake, the world mobilizes. We send food, we send water, medicine, we save lives. But what happens next? What happens when the cameras pack up and the emergency crews head home? Well, there's this really persistent, frustrating gap between the life-saving aid and the long, hard road to actually rebuilding a stable society. In this explainer, we're going to break down why bridging that gap is one of the toughest challenges on the planet.
Okay, let's start with a quote that just nails the problem. Sadako Ogata, who was a total legend at the UN, once said, "There are no humanitarian solutions to humanitarian problems." So what does that really mean? It means that blankets, food, and tents can't fix the deep political and economic problems that started the crisis in the first place. They're an absolutely critical first step, for sure, but they are not the final answer.
So here's our game plan. First, we're going to dig into that paradox. Why throwing more money at the problem hasn't fixed it? Then we'll look at the different playbooks the world has come up with to try and solve this. We'll put those playbooks to the test in two very different situations, armed conflict and natural disasters. And finally, we'll pull it all together to see what we've really learned.
All right, let's start with the money. Because believe it or not, the world is spending more than ever on humanitarian aid. We've gotten incredibly good at that first, emergency part. But that next crucial step, getting from crisis back to some kind of normal life, that remains a massive challenge. Just look at the scale of this increase. It's staggering. Back in 1999, global humanitarian funding was around $4.4 billion. Fast forward to 2016, and that number exploded to over $27 billion. That's a six-fold increase. So the resources are definitely flowing. The real question is, are they solving the right problems?
And that gets us to the core puzzle. If we've got more money and expertise than ever, why do we keep seeing countries get stuck in this terrible loop of crisis and relapse? A perfect example is Timor-Leste. After a really long, brutal struggle, it finally got its independence in 2002 with a ton of international support. But just 4 years later, boom, it plunged right back into crisis. This isn't a failure of generosity, it's a failure to connect the dots. A failure to bridge that gap between short-term relief and long-term development.
So, faced with this problem, the international community didn't just throw its hands up. It actually went to the drawing board and created a whole series of strategies, different playbooks you could call them, to try and solve this crisis continuum.
Now, to understand the solutions, you first have to get this one key term, the continuum. It's a concept that the UN made official way back in 1991, and it basically describes the ideal path. First comes immediate relief, then you get recovery, rebuilding, and finally, long-term development. The problem is, in the real world, these phases are often treated like completely separate worlds, with different teams, different money, and different goals.
And this table here, it shows you the evolution of how people have tried to fix that disconnect. The first idea was pretty simple: linking relief, rehabilitation, and development, or LRRD. Just try to get the phases to talk to each other. Then came the gap approach, which zeroed in on the walls between humanitarian groups and development banks. Japan's seamless approach and the UN's early recovery tried to blur the lines even more, starting development work while the relief phase was still happening. And all of these ideas were building toward the latest concept, the one at the bottom: resilience.
Resilience. You hear this word everywhere now, and for good reason. It totally shifts the focus. Instead of just managing these phases, the goal is to build up the inherent strength of a community or country so they can handle future shocks themselves. It's not just about bouncing back, it's about bouncing back stronger. But the million-dollar question is, do these theories actually work in the real world?
To find out, we have to understand not all crises are the same. We're going to look at two big arenas here. With armed conflicts, the real challenge is dealing with fragile states and the politics of aid. With natural disasters, it's all about rebuilding better and trying to coordinate a massive flood of help. You need a different playbook for each one.
Okay, let's start with armed conflict. There's this common idea that you can draw a straight line from war to peace. But as we're about to see, that's pretty much a myth. The classic UN model from the 90s, the Agenda for Peace, laid it all out in a neat, orderly path. You start with diplomacy to prevent the war. If that doesn't work, you make peace, then you keep the peace, and only then, once all that is done, you start to rebuild. It looks so logical, so clean on paper. But it's just not how the world works.
Right, because in the real world, these phases are a total mess. They all happen at once. You might be trying to negotiate peace in one part of a country while you have peacekeepers in another, and you're trying to start rebuilding in a third. The UN even admitted this later on, but that old, linear way of thinking, it's really hard to shake.
And let's never, ever forget the human cost behind all these abstract models. During that long fight for independence in Timor-Leste, more than 100,000 people died. And that's in a country with less than 1 million people to begin with. The stakes just couldn't be any higher.
This non-linear reality leads to this giant dilemma. I mean, everybody agrees that for peace to stick, it has to be locally owned. But what if the local government is part of the problem? Donors want to support the state, but that can mean propping up a system that's fragile or corrupt or both. There's this idea, almost a myth, that if you just build a perfect liberal state, peace will just follow. But as we've seen from South Sudan to Timor-Leste, it is never that simple.
Now let's shift gears and look at a totally different context: natural disasters. These events are obviously tragic, but a lot of people see them as a window of opportunity to not just rebuild, but to actually build back better.
The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami was a real turning point. The world responded with this incredible wave of generosity. A staggering $13.5 billion was donated. For once, money wasn't the main problem. The challenge was figuring out how to spend it wisely to create change that would actually last.
And this is really where the idea of Build Back Better, or BBB, took hold. The goal wasn't just to replace the houses and roads that got wiped out. It was to build more resilient houses, create better jobs, and make communities stronger against the next disaster.
And here you can see a crystal clear example of learning in action. Indonesia was hit incredibly hard by the 2004 tsunami. The response was massive, but putting up new houses was slow and the quality was all over the place. Just 2 years later, a huge earthquake hit Java. This time, they took what they learned. By using a community-driven approach, empowering locals, they rebuilt over 250,000 stronger, more resilient houses in just 2 years. That's real, tangible progress.
So, after looking at the theories and these real-world examples, what are the big takeaways? What have we really learned from decades of trying to manage these crises?
Well, first, there's no magic bullet. All those playbooks we looked at, they're just frameworks. They have to be adapted to what's happening on the ground. Second, coordination is everything, but the context is king. In the Philippines, the government was strong and led the response, so donors didn't need to coordinate as much. In Honduras, after Hurricane Mitch, the government was totally overwhelmed, so coordination was essential. Third, that local ownership paradox is a real and dangerous trap. And finally, in the mad rush to respond, long-term prevention almost always gets pushed aside, which just sets the stage for the next disaster.
Which leaves us with this final massive question. With all this effort and all these billions of dollars, are we actually building a more resilient world? Or are we just getting better at coming up with new names for the same frustrating cycle, from LSRD to seamless to resilience, only to feel that sense of déjà vu the next time a crisis hits?